Welcome back to Where the F is My Village. I'm your host, Stefanie Ferris, and I'll be joined in just a second by my co-host, Shelley Cadamy. Today we discuss advocating for legislation that supports and benefits families raising tricky kids and why it is important to be involved in advocacy. Later in the episode, we will be interviewing Arnie Eby, the director of the National Foster Parent Association. He will discuss how his organization advocates and supports foster families. We started this podcast because we know how isolating it can be to raise a tricky kid. So if you're new to the podcast, welcome to our village. And villagers, thanks for coming back for a new episode. We're so glad you're here. Hey, Shelley.
Good morning. Good morning. Good morning. So good morning, villagers. I just want to say that if Stefanie's energy is a little off, it's because she has COVID. And let me say she has it for the first time. So she's a late bloomer. I feel like
I'm so sad. I was like, I'm a super dodger. I have this very exceptional DNA. And literally 5 people yesterday texted me and they're like, oh no, you lost your super dodger status. So I will be faking energy and going back to bed as soon as we are done with this.
So I just assumed you'd already had it. And then when you emailed me and I thought, oh my goodness, this is her first time. So I have had it 3 times. And before anybody messages me or comments that I should be more careful, I am probably more careful than 90% of the people I know. I am the only person at the Chamber of Commerce meeting wearing a mask. However, the first time I got it was February 2020. Second time was from my granddaughter. Third time was from my son. So if it were not for children,
yeah, I got it because of my son.
I would have had it once.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. My 13-year-old, who never leaves his bedroom, somehow gave it to me. And I think it's because we call him downstairs around 10. He comes downstairs, he sits on the couch next to me and gives me a hug and a kiss, and then he runs to bed. And it's that kiss he gave me a Tuesday on my cheek. When he tested positive for COVID, I was like, oh, because literally people are like, how did he get COVID? He never leaves his room and we've had sleet all week. Did it manifest in your house? He went to school a few hours on Monday before the sleet got really bad. So that must be the window where we got it.
The last time I had it was from my son, who has been training his entire life for a pandemic. Much like your son. He doesn't really leave his room. He didn't really leave his room while he had COVID, but he left it. Well, but I mean, you also have to think about central heat and air, right? So like if someone is I love how people are like, I'm going to go in a different room and that no one will get it except HVAC.
I have a strategy. So the strategy, first of all, we have this ridiculous air purifier that's the size of like R2-D2, and it goes outside the door. So Casey's had it, my youngest has had it, my oldest, and now me, and none of us have this is the first time one of us has contracted it at home. Like when my husband had it, he didn't give it to anybody, and when he had it, he didn't give it to anybody because we it's like a crackdown, like probably like at the beginning of the movie Outbreak with the people in the yellow suits running in. We stuff a towel under the door so that the air can't suck out of your room. We're not playing. We're not playing over here. So we'll see.
Okay, I love that. There are definitely advantages to living in 2 different houses. We're in the age of COVID. So my husband and his son just stayed at their house when we had COVID. Anyway, that was our big strategy. That was our big complicated strategy. Leave the house. Okay, so this is the first episode we've recorded since we launched.
Yes.
We dropped 3 episodes. Dropped. Let me sound like
we did. We dropped them.
Although that's probably from the 90s, and I just think it's hip. I
think that's what they call it. My album drops on Friday. I don't know. Right.
So we have 3 live episodes, and Stefanie is in charge of actually getting those out there. Stefanie does a whole lot of work for this podcast. getting those out there, and also checking every 7 minutes to see how many downloads we have. So, Stephanie, how many
We
downloads do we
we
have
have
right now?
almost 300, which is
Wow. Okay,
very
seriously?
exciting. Yes.
Oh, okay. The last number she sent me was 200. So that really, wow, 300.
So we should
That's
probably
amazing.
we should acknowledge that the like 40-second like ad spot is included in that, but I think a lot of people are
Hmm.
hearing about it and clicking on that. Probably point of entry is to listen to that, and then they probably are listening to another episode. So, but you know what? I'm going to count it. They
Hmm.
listen to it as
I started to
130.
say that's a nice caveat, but I'm still going to be like, woo, we have 300 downloads.
Yeah.
And my anxiety was that we would have 0 downloads. And so I'm going to be okay with 300.
Yeah. Well, my goal is to have 500 by Friday, and I don't really know why I picked that number. I think it might be a little arbitrary, but that's the number I'm shooting for. So we'll see.
And we're recording this the Tuesday. We're recording this on February 7th, which is a Tuesday. So
That's right.
by Friday the 10th, we need 500 downloads.
Yes.
Okay.
Which will be in the past by the time this airs. So I'm going to time
Yes, it
travel.
will
Sorry.
be. Yeah. So get in your DeLorean and go back and download our podcast. Okay, so in all seriousness, the whole reason we are doing this podcast is to make raising tricky kids less isolating. And I shared a text that I had permission to share. I shared it on a TikTok, but I'm going to go ahead and share it now. Stephanie, if that's okay, because I don't know
Yeah.
that I actually
No,
asked you.
I saw that video this morning. It was very sweet.
So the whole point is, this is so hard. I've been doing this for 14 years. Stephanie's been doing it. How long have you been doing it?
I don't know, 7 to 10. I'm not sure.
7,000
Right.
years.
I feel like I never had normal, if you want to be, I want to be honest about it.
So we really want this to be less isolating for people. We don't want people to have to suffer. And suffer seems like kind of a strong word, but we don't want people to suffer in silence.
If you feel super alone and dealing with something that is huge, like raising a tricky kid, I mean, it is a form of suffering because you're walking around, you're like that depression medication ad where you're sad, but you have a smiley face stick in front of your face because
That's
you feel
actually,
you feel like you can't.
go ahead.
I mean, there are people I talk to about this, but it's not like an everyday, yeah, so my child is inpatient treatment. How are you? Like, it's just not how.
Well, that's the definition of emotional labor, actually, that setting aside your actual emotions
Yeah.
to put on, a smiley face. So anyway, the whole reason we're doing this is so that we can use our experiences and our expertise, although again, we are not experts, we have lived experience, to help people like us who are raising tricky kids to feel less alone, less isolated, and feel more supported and actually be more supported with resources. By the way, we have a good start on resources on our website, where the F is myvillage.com. If you want to share resources with us, please do, because we certainly don't know everything. So that's the whole point. And with that, I'm going to read this text that, again, I have permission to read. Hey, Shelley, wanted to let you know I listened to episode 3 yesterday on my drive home from visiting my kid at an undisclosed specialty psychiatric hospital from which he is getting discharged unsuccessfully. It was so helpful to hear your story, even though I already knew parts of it. After I listened to it, I cried and cried. I guess I hadn't even realized how alone I felt. I'll leave a podcast review too. Just wanted to tell you, thanks for putting it out there. So I joked in the TikTok that only people raising tricky kids are like, hey, having my worst day ever. Wanted to let you know. And by the way, I'll leave a review for your podcast.
Yeah, exactly. I'm still looking out for others. I'm
going to review it. Hey,
Oh,
and
I love that.
I know. So for those of you who have not listened to episode 3 is about when my local district attorney filed a termination of my parental rights. And also within that is me driving to pick up my kid from a specialized psychiatric hospital and driving her 2 hours, which sounds like not a big deal, but it's a big deal. Listen to the episode, and that will all make more sense. I do want to share a little bit more than I shared in the TikTok, and that her text continues. We are in a fun situation because he's getting discharged for violent behavior with a recommendation to go to behavioral treatment facility. But most behavioral facilities don't want to take a kid with sexual misconduct, which is the hospital he's at now is for sex trauma. So yet another catch-22, yet another impossible situation. I understand this because I also went through this. So the hospitals that specialize in sex trauma don't want someone with violence, and the ones who specialize in behavior don't want someone who has sexual misconduct. And so, I ran into this with hospitals that specialize in certain things, but didn't want someone with reactive attachment disorder because of the violence that comes along with that and also the running away. I feel like you have to be pretty special to bust out of a locked down facility 3 times, which my oldest daughter did. I feel like you should probably get an award.
Well, this isn't an area that I have experience in. However, I'm just going to guess that a lot of people have overlap in these issues that they need help with, and these facilities acting like you just can only be in like one column. And if you are in 2 columns, you can't come here. I mean, where do you go? There's nowhere to go.
Yeah, that's kind of the point. And so there may be reasons for that I'm unaware of. Maybe we have a pretty silly structure for insurance, for the way that these hospitals get paid, et cetera. So if you know why that is, we'd love for you to email us or call us why the specializations are so niche. Because, very few kids are going to have, to your point, Stefanie, stuff in one column only. So anyway, I appreciate my friend for sharing that and giving me permission to share it with everyone. We want to hear more of those. We want to hear more from you. We'd love to know what is helping, and we'd love to know what you want to hear more of. So with that, we're going to shift into the topic for today, which is how legislation and policy affects people with tricky kids. And we're going to be interviewing someone later who knows a whole lot about that. But for now, we're going to be sharing a couple of examples before he comes on.
Perfect. Where do you want to start?
Okay, so let me say again, I'm not an expert, but I have been fairly involved in the legislative system in our state and nationally, just as a informed citizen and someone raising tricky kids. And so one thing that impacts people in the foster adoption system is changes to Medicaid. In most states, people who have foster kiddos or have adopted foster kiddos, their kids are eligible for Medicaid, which is amazing because very often Medicaid is more robust than private insurance. So any changes to Medicaid are huge, and that usually happens at the federal level. And so we're going to be interviewing Arnie Eby later, and I'll explain who he is and ask him to comment on that. The second thing is I want to give an example of something that happened in Oklahoma where Stefanie and I both live. Changes to who can foster adopt. And I don't remember the Senate bill, or I don't remember the number for this. We'll have to post it when we share the episode. Several years ago, legislation was introduced that was morality legislation that allowed religious-based organizations who receive federal funds. Okay, so I just want to say that. I want to say that like 25 times. Who receive federal and or state funds. Actually, it wasn't federal because it was state legislation. I apologize. State funds. So, but let me go back and say sometimes state funds are really federal funds that funnel through the state. So what it did was allow just organizations to discriminate against people with tax dollars, with state funds. And so if those religious organizations were involved in foster and adoption, they could use those state funds, those taxpayer dollars, to say, hey, Shelley, you're a single woman, you don't attend church, we don't think you should be a foster parent.
It's not much
So
of a separation of church and state, I think, is the
No.
biggest thing, is that, money that should be going to anyone, just, no matter what their religious affiliation, is going to organizations that are being, putting their own agenda on top of the legislation. And that's a huge problem. That's not how this should work.
Well, I mean, it's a huge problem for a couple of reasons. One, it's discrimination, just flat out. Two, there aren't enough foster parents in the world.
Right. It's not like there's like really long line and they're like, you know what? Just the cream of the crop. Like, no, we need more.
Like, hey, you know what? We need to cull this a bit. Yeah, no, there are not enough foster parents to foster all the children in the foster care system in Oklahoma right now. There are certainly not enough people to adopt them. So like my example, I adopted 3 older children with disabilities, a sibling group of 3. There are not a whole lot of people who are willing to do that. And so when you take a small group and then you make it smaller, that's not super family friendly. And we love to talk about how pro-family we are in Oklahoma, but that is not pro-family. You're making it so that kids are going to age out of the foster care system having never been fostered and or adopted. And so that legislation was unfortunately passed. It is in place right now. It is law. And until somebody sues the state of Oklahoma, which I hope someone does, frankly, it's not just in Oklahoma where this is happening. It was legislation that was a template legislation that was shared by a federal lobbying organization to different states to get them to introduce it at the state level and get it passed. And so even though I'm talking about Oklahoma, there are other states where this is happening and has happened. And so getting involved at the state level is how you can keep those things from happening. I hate to say play defense, but very often you're playing defense to just keep that stuff from happening. It's even better if you can be proactive and work with the legislators to do positive things.
Yeah, and I think all too often, and I've been guilty of this, we really pay attention to these big national elections.
Mm-hmm.
And what really affects you and me's like everyday life is what the state and city government come up with. And I would think most people don't know even the names of the representatives that are driving to the Capitol on a regular basis and making these laws, let alone knowing how to reach out to them and lobby. And what the state government does has a huge effect on you. And I know the national elections get a ton of attention, and rightly so. But if you want to change your life and your community's life fast, you need to get involved at a local level. Is my personal.
Well, and school boards.
Yeah.
School boards are, oh, wow, there's so much action in school boards right now. A lot of entities are paying attention to getting people elected on school boards. And oh gosh, there's a whole lot of policy that affects kids, obviously, because these are schools, that is happening on local school boards. Pay attention to what's happening.
Well, and the reason all of this matters is because if you have a tricky kid, there are federal laws that, you can, I'm sorry, I'm struggling to think with my COVID brain.
You're fine.
But anyway,
I told you before we started, COVID brain is a thing.
Just need to go back to bed.
COVID brain is a thing.
But anyway, the thing that has a direct impact on tricky kids and the services they get and how they are treated and what federal laws are actually enforced on a local level, that's the big thing. I mean, if you have a tricky kid and they're in a public school system and you need to get services for them, this all matters. And then the second anything gets extra squirrely, if DHS comes in or something like that, then you really need to understand the laws and your rights. And it's unfortunate that I know people who've had to go get attorneys to fight with their school district over what they should be doing and how they're breaking oftentimes their own policies. But if you don't take the time, I mean, the other day I like downloaded this school district's entire policy manual and was reading through it, trying to figure out where they were coming up with the things that they were acting on against my friend's family. And it's so important to know. And the thing is no one appreciates it when you're like, hey, on page 10 of your school district's manual, it says this is how you handle this situation. And you are not doing that. But you need to know that information. And it's usually all available online. It just takes some digging to find.
Yeah, so let's talk more about that, because I think you know more about federal education legislation, certainly, than I do. And federal legislation is what defines what we call special education. And I think is it IDEA? I don't know. We'll go back and we'll post some stuff. But do you want to talk more about that?
Well, sure. I mean, the federal laws basically go through, and they're, in my opinion, I think they're well written for exactly what a child with a diagnosis or an educational disability of some kind is entitled to in a school. And is pretty detailed. I mean, I didn't even realize until recently that if your child is on an IEP or a 504 plan, that they're supposed to be meeting with you, setting goals for a quarterly basis, and then meeting with you again at the end of the quarter to discuss how it went and what is our goal going to be for next quarter. All I ever have had is let's have a meeting at the beginning of the year. Do we need to make any changes to this little document? Okay, never going to talk to you again. Bye. Like, it's like there are these tools in place, and I realize that they are written in an idealized world where everyone at this school has time to roll all of this out. But the bottom line is the laws are there. The school districts should know them. And honestly, like when I first started this whole journey, and, I had to learn the difference between an IEP and a 504 plan. IEP is individualized education plan. So that's for a kid who maybe needs extra attention with the actual learning, educating part. And then the 504 plan is for somebody like my kid with ADHD, who he needs accommodations. Like, he can do the work. He maybe just can't handle the classroom. And he needs accommodations. So, I mean, when I kind of kept getting pushback on wanting to do a 504 plan, I started looking up all of the federal laws, and I attached them to an email to the principal and said, here's his diagnosis letter. This is what he's entitled to under the law. And you have this much time to meet with me. And I brought it to the meeting, and I had stuff highlighted because they weren't necessarily like, you know what, there's all these things that you're entitled to. Let's discuss how we can implement them, because they have too much going on and it's a lot. But at the same time, as a parent, you have to find a way to be supportive of your school and in other ways. Like, what burden can I take off of my teachers and administration, while simultaneously saying, I need to give you an extra list of things to do for my kid because he's entitled to them under federal law. And it's not joking around. I mean, my friend has a attorney from a federally funded disability law center helping her right now because this particular school district has just ignored all federal guidelines. They just did whatever they wanted. And luckily, my friend knew what her rights were under the law, because otherwise you just go home and you go, oh, this is terrible. I can't believe they're treating my kid this way. And you don't know. And the mental energy it has involved to fight these fights. I mean, it's like your full-time job. You need to know what your rights are, and then you need to know what accommodations are reasonable to ask for, and then you need to follow up and make sure that they're doing the accommodations. Just like we talked about on another episode, and you're constantly using up your political capital every time you reach out to the school. You're like, hey, so,
Right.
I know he asked for a break today and he wasn't allowed to take one, even though his accommodation plan says he should be able to take breaks, as long as he's not interrupting instruction time. So what happened there? Like, constant follow up. And it's, I don't know, should I just go to school every day with him? I think.
No. Yeah. So let me take a minute here to say, I think it's important to be informed about federal law regarding education, even if you don't have to reference it. So the thing that I did wrong, or that I would do differently, is I always went into every situation assuming the best. Like I was super naive, right? Oh, I'm sure they're going to work with me. I'm sure they're going to be collaborative, regardless of motivation. Maybe it is that they're overwhelmed. Maybe it is that they have 72 kids to deal with that day. Regardless, you have to know what what the legislation says so that you can help guide them to provide what your kid needs. So even if you don't have to reference it during a meeting, I think it's really, really important to know what it is. And there are organizations out there that are advocacy organizations that will help you get up to speed so you don't have to reinvent the wheel. And Arnie has just joined us. Hi, Arnie. We've got Arnie Eby. He's the executive director of the National Foster Care Association. And I met Arnie via the work that I do, the work I get paid to do, not the podcast. And he is really impressive. He has lived experience as a foster adoptive parent, as well as being executive director of the National Foster Care Association. And he's really easy to talk to, Arnie. He explains things in a way that is easy to understand, and he's very savvy when it comes to Capitol Hill. And so I thought it would be helpful to interview him when we're talking about why does federal legislation and policy, why does it affect people who are raising tricky kids? And Arnie, just an FYI, tricky kids is a term that Stefanie came up with that I think is very useful in describing all the kids we're raising. And so with that, I'd like to ask you to talk about why does federal legislation matter to those of us who are raising tricky kids? And then after you've talked about that, talk a little bit about how we can get involved at various different levels. And if people only have a little, limited amount of time, which almost everyone does, where are the most impactful places they can get involved?
Well, I wish it was simple, and I wish that it was real easy to say that you could go to Capitol Hill and change one or two things in federal legislation, and it would make your situation at home better. But I think we have to start in reverse, and at least that's the way I know it. I learned it in reverse, starting at the local level and working my way across 22 years to Capitol Hill. Federal legislation trickles down, and it trickles down from the feds to a state, and then the state figures out how they're going to apply this guidance that comes from the federal government. And then as they apply guidance, it comes down through your state agencies as best practice. And I'll give you an example. Best practice in Baltimore City, which is 60 miles east of me, is different than best practice in rural Maryland, where I live, where the demographics and everything about life is very different. And so you have to understand how those kind of things impact your story, your situation, and your solution.
So maybe give an example of something that happens at the federal level that people may not realize is a trickle down to them locally.
There's regulation in a lot of states that if your child is in foster care, you should be paying child support. Now, unfortunately, if your child is in foster care, you probably are having either economic difficulties or some other type of situation that requires a better utilization of your funds than paying child support.
Well, I haven't spent a lot of time in the foster system learning about it. Were you just saying that if someone's children are placed into the foster care system, that they're having to pay child support into the system to support
Yes.
that kid? Oh,
Yes.
Lordy. Okay.
And that becomes...
I was that person. I had to pay child support. In Oklahoma, if you are not financially able to pay the child support, then it's not required.
Okay.
But determining how someone is financially able is subjective. So,
Okay.
Now, this creates barriers on multiple levels. First of all, It also creates a barrier if your child then goes into kinship care, because kinship providers are not necessarily wanting to have an extra burden on their son or daughter who, let's just say it's a grandparent situation. They're hoping their son or daughter is able to work things out, and adding the child support is just another hurdle to that. And so it is a big hurdle in kinship care, but it's also a hurdle in foster care, because we see and we have situations where resource parents who are working with these biological parents that they are arrested at these visits for non-payment of child support. And so what we see is a system where states have regulation, because this comes down either from the federal government or it's in their state legislation, and it's the way they apply these type of things. Now, last year, in June of 2022, the Children's Bureau provided guidance to the states, saying that in these situations, they felt that child support should not be charged. But is it a legislative fix in a state, or is it a regulatory fix? And so you have to understand that balance or that tension as it plays out in your situation. And that's why I said it's not only the story of that happening to a child in your care and a family you're potentially building a relationship with, it's the situation and what is the fix in your state. And you can use the federal guidance to help with that fix, and then that's how you arrive at the solution. And so the solution may be by getting your state to change its regulations. If your state's not willing to change those regulations, the fix may be finding a legislator or someone who's willing to introduce a bill, and then you work through it in that direction. And I'll give you an example. In Maryland right now, we have a new governor. The House, the Senate, and the governor are all Democrats, and they've vowed to work together, but there's multiple bills and multiple legislative fixes that were being attempted in the previous year in the State House, but this year, because of the new format and the new governor, those legislative fixes are not being reintroduced this year, because they're hoping the new governor will work with the legislators and come up with regulatory fixes that could potentially solve these. So what I'm saying is, you look at all these things, you learn through these things, and then you decide where is the best place to advocate, and what is the right time to advocate. Because last year, with a Republican governor, a legislative fix was probably the right thing to try to do. This year, with a different administration, the strategy is different. And your strategy is not necessarily going to be the same from one year to the next. And so that's where you develop your savvy by being there. You're in the moment, you hear what people are saying. And just because you did something last year that looked to be promising this year doesn't mean that you do it the same way.
So you work with some state associations that could possibly help individuals understand what's happening in their state and understand maybe some talking points, maybe ways to engage. But can you talk about the difference between regulation, policy, and legislation? Because I could take a crack at that, but I think you will be better.
Well, legislation is something that is in state law. But when a law is written, then they generally write the regulations or how it's going to be applied, because a law is not going to be applicable in every situation, or it's not necessarily always going to address every situation. Then as it's applied down through the jurisdictions or the counties, it's going to probably be applied differently, like I said, in a urban situation, and then it would be applied in a rural situation. And it probably should be.
Let's back up a little bit, because I think not everyone understands why a kiddo in foster care's biological parents getting arrested is bad. So let's talk about that really quickly. Let me just fill in the blanks. So, for example, I am a grandmother raising a granddaughter, and eventually her parents will be asked to pay child support to me. So, the biological parents need support in being able to build their lives and being able to eventually get to the point where they can healthily parent. While that law is well meaning, it actually has multiple negative side effects that actually prevent a family from being a healthy family. That's a perfect example of why someone might want to get involved and how this stuff is crafted, how it becomes law, and how it's interpreted. So, can you talk a little bit about your organization and how you work with state organizations to impact some of this stuff?
Yes, I'm the executive director for the National Foster Parent Association. You can contact us through our website. However, we do have a council of state affiliates where we work with states. So one of the things that we're doing right now at the NFPA is working on a set of questions that you can use. So if something doesn't feel right, you don't have information, or there's something you want to know more about, you'll know how to ask the questions to get that information. Because without the right questions, you're not going to end up with the answers that lead to change.
That's such a good point, Arnie. Thank you. And we'll share the state, National Council, and state legislators on our resources page on our website. What are some other resources for people who are just getting started? Like you mentioned that you started yourself at a local level and then eventually got to the federal level. Are there resources that if you were doing this all over again, resources that you would suggest, or ways to sort of dip a toe into the water, this world that can be a little bit overwhelming and daunting for people?
I think, first of all, the world is overpowering and it is exhausting in many, many ways. And the first thing that you have to do is figure out how to take care of yourself. And if you don't have a good set of peer-to-peer supports, you're not going to survive. And I don't mean that casually. If you're out there on your own, don't jump into federal legislation or those type of issues, because you're going to drown really quick in a big, big sea. And then when you ask the question, what I maybe wish I had known, I mean, if I would have known too much, I'd have never started the journey. I was just dumb enough to keep trying and keep asking questions and keep learning. It's been an incredible journey.
It's interesting because the whole point, I don't know that I've shared this with you, the whole reason that Stefanie and I are doing this podcast, and the reason for the incredibly inflammatory title, is because we run into so many people who are raising tricky kids who don't have a village. And we wanted to provide a village, provide resources, provide support for people who are raising tricky kids, so it's not so isolating as it has been for she and I. And so that is beautiful advice.
I think it's also important to think about the fact that I would assume that most people turn to advocacy because they're so frustrated with the situation they're in. And if you're in a situation that's hard and tricky, you're also in a situation where, like, you're not firing on all cylinders. You're tired. Maybe everything about your life in that moment is stressful because you're trying to balance all of these things. And if you're fostering, you're trying to advocate for your kid and also trying to be like, is this really what the law is? And how do I fix this? And who do I talk to? And it can be so emotionally draining because your brain never gets a break. I mean, you go to sleep and you wake up the next morning and you're still in whatever the thing that you started with yesterday was. And I think that's been the hardest thing for me about parenting a tricky kid, even though he's a biological kid, is that, like, he's always here. Like, there's no break from the life that you're in all of the time. So if there isn't some support system, and I just love that your organization exists, because people just need at least a starting point. Shelley and I went and spoke at a foster adopt group at a church recently where the kids come in and they get to do a craft and the foster parents get to go have dinner. And so we spoke and mingled with those people. And I was just thinking, this seems like a small thing and there's really not that many people here, but I bet it's huge for the foster parents who are here and get to eat dinner while church volunteers are making pine cone something with the kids. And they can just get like a mental break and also talk to people who are in similar situations as them. It's huge.
Yes, community is something that we've lost in so many ways, and the pandemic certainly didn't help. But we do have to find those people that give us that breath of respite. And I think that that's one thing that we need to figure out how to change, because respite in the past has been defined by an overnight stay. But if you have a tricky kid who has medical issues, you're not going to want that kid to stay someplace overnight so that you can get some respite. You know that you give that child their medication at 12 o'clock, and you know that your window is between 12 p.m. noon and 5 p.m. So your respite is between 12:01 p.m. and 4:59 p.m. And you need somebody who's going to fill that gap.
Arnie, I have 10 or 15 TED Talks in my head about how the world should work regarding parents like us. In my mind, it makes sense, instead of taking the kids somewhere unfamiliar, to stay with someone they've never met, because that's, for those of you who are uninitiated, that's how the foster care system works. Or it did when I was doing foster care. Maybe it's different in different states, but respite was, there are certain people who are qualified respite providers who are also foster parents, and you take your kids there and they stay there for a day or two or three to give you respite. Well, I was never willing to do that. Whether that's right or wrong. I felt like my kids had so much trauma and so many different places. I mean, we don't even know how many foster homes my kids were in before they got to me. My son was in at least 3, between a year and a half and 3 years old when he came to me. So I felt like for their emotional health, it wasn't great to take them to yet another place. But because of that, I didn't get a break ever. And I was a single foster parent. And so I think what makes more sense is to fund some sort of in-home care where someone comes in for 24 hours or 3 nights or 3 days or whatever to say, hey, mom or dad or whatever, grandparents, whoever you are, you take a break and I'm going to make sure the kids get their medicine and their food and they get to school. Like, that seems like a civilized way to do things, but we barely fund anything. And so I don't know how that would actually get funded in the universe we live in, but I just feel like we do so many things backwards.
Well, there are some movements around life cycle respite, and some of that's built on seniors or people with dementia. As it emerges and develops, there may be some ways to piggyback that as well. But I think the simplest thing is to really start with a redefinition of what respite is.
That's a great point. And we are coming up on the end of our time. Stefanie, is there anything that you want to ask that we haven't covered?
Well, we were in the fostering world very briefly. And I think for me, I'm a big researcher, but just having a couple places where you can tell a new foster parent, hey, if you have questions, go to this website. If you feel like you need support, go to this website. Instead of sitting there and going, I'm so overwhelmed. And also when you're fostering, at least for me, I didn't really want it to affect like future placements for me to say maybe how poorly something was going, if that makes sense, because I don't want to be judged, but I also, oh my God, this is not going well. I need help. I think it's important for people to have like the freedom to ask questions and not there being a consequence or judgment for them not knowing something, and getting answers quickly and kindly.
Yeah. One of the other resources that we have at the National Foster Parent Association is our training institute. So it's nfpati.org. That's alive 24/7. It has multiple different courses. There's things on there, and let's just take cutting as an example. If you have a child and you're encountering that for the first time, it's probably Saturday night at 10 p.m. And you may not be able to get your caseworker to answer the phone, but hopefully you could log on to your account at NFPATI and get a small or a quick tutorial on what maybe to do, how to keep it all together, that type of thing. You're going to get that information, that support in real time at no cost to you.
Wow. I love that. I love that a lot.
Yeah, I especially love that's probably going to happen at, Saturday at 11 o'clock in the evening. That is traditionally when anything happens at my house. And I think we're not unusual in that case. So, Arnie, tell us anything else you want to tell us about your association, what your mission is, and how people can get involved.
Well, our mission is to be a respected voice, and our goal is to do that through networking, education, and advocacy.
Thank you. Okay, I really appreciate you doing this. I appreciate Stefanie doing it because she really just needs to go to bed. If you're just getting started, Google Find My Legislators, which will generate some kind of link to help you find those. Secondly, do what Arnie said. Make sure you're taking care of yourself before you embark on advocacy, which is a good idea for anything, really. And like Stefanie said, many of us make our way into advocacy because of a challenge we've encountered ourselves. Find something that is meaningful to you and about which you can use your own experience and story to persuade lawmakers and policymakers to understand why change makes sense. Then look around to see who is already working on that issue, because you really shouldn't do this stuff alone, and everyone has limited time and energy, so conserve yours and don't reinvent the wheel. Check out the National Foster Parent Association website as well as their training institute, even if you are not a foster adoptive parent, because many of the topics they cover in their training are relevant to all tricky kids. And both of those links are on our resources page at wherethefismyvillage.com. We appreciate you listening today, and we hope you will continue to listen, share, give us reviews and ratings where you listen to podcasts, and give us feedback via our website, where you can also tell us your stories, request to be interviewed, suggest someone to be interviewed, and just generally engage, because we need that. That website, again, is wherethefismyvillage.com. Also join our Facebook group where you can find your fellow villagers for support and resources. Take care of yourselves, villagers. This is Shelley signing off until next time.
Where the F is My Village is produced by Shelley Academy and me, Stefanie Ferris, with editing by Stefanie Ferris. Special thanks to Jason Academy for writing and creating our original music. Where the F is My Village is an SPSC production.